So thank you very much for inviting me to this very well attended conference. It's really an honor. I will talk about mindfulness, a very ambitious title. Current findings on mindfulness. Of course, that encompasses quite a big deal. I would stand here next week if I would try to cover everything that entails. So I have to prioritize a little bit. I will talk most specifically about findings of my research group, and that pertains mostly to inhibitory control. I think inhibitory control is extremely relevant in the context of normal adaptive functioning, but also very relevant in many clinical conditions that you know of. So obviously I will tell a little bit more about the relevance of inhibitory control. So what is mindfulness? I will talk a little bit about it in a moment, but first I will just briefly provide you with an outline of what you can expect from my talk. So first of all, I will briefly outline what mindfulness is, a very broad conceptualization because the applications, of course, they vary a bit. So I'll provide a very broad definition of what mindfulness entails. Then I will talk about some findings pertaining to trait mindfulness, dispositional mindfulness, but also mindfulness training. And I think it makes sense to discuss them together because there's a lot of overlap between the two, and I don't just ask you to just trust me. I will, of course, support it with some research findings. So then a very important question that of course should ideally be addressed, and I think that can be addressed in very generalized terms, is mindfulness effective? Does it benefit people? So from a clinical perspective or from an applied perspective, that's very relevant. And then I will move to current findings from my group. We focus on many different aspects, but I will focus myself a little bit more on inhibitory control because I think it's a really key component that's at the heart of what we're doing actually in the department in the context of addiction. And particularly we'll talk about the relationship between mindfulness and inhibitory control. And a lot of studies have been done, not just in my group, but in previous groups as well. So I will talk a little bit about the intricacies of this relationship. And lastly, I will talk about one potential method, with the emphasis on potential, for potentially boosting the effect of mindfulness using a neuromodulatory strategy. And I will end, of course, maybe that's even the most important, with a take-home message. So what do these studies together, how are they informative and also for you? So definitions of mindfulness, they vary. You come across different definitions. So I follow Carlson in defining mindfulness as the capacity or capability to consciously, with conscious awareness, focus on both internal or somatic and external experiences in an open, discerning, and attentive, and I should also add non-judgmental way, because that's also generally part of this definition of mindfulness. As I mentioned before, mindfulness training and dispositional mindfulness overlap in many ways. There are also some differences. You have non-specific effects that contribute to observed effects when you talk about mindfulness training, but there's a lot of overlap. In many ways, both, first of all, and I think that's relevant also to understand some of the results that we find in our studies, that both are associated with various effects in the brain. So both are associated, and that's a little bit of a generalization. There are many other components that are obviously involved, but some are very relevant to mention, is that they're associated with activity within the default mode network. So when mindfulness is relatively increased, we can see a concurrent reduction of on the default mode network activity, which is very relevant also in the context of depression, which is characterized by a relatively enhanced activity of the default mode network, which is associated, not limited to, rumination, of which Junji will probably know a lot more about. So that's very relevant also in terms of what you can expect of treatment effects as mediated by brain activity correlates. And inversely, and this is also very important to note, especially in relation to inhibitory control, it's also associated with enhanced, so the inverse, enhanced activity in the salience network, which understandably is also associated with greater present moment awareness or sensitivity to salient and relevant stimuli. And in terms of behavioral output, both are associated with both cognitive but also affective processes. First of all, is mindfulness helpful? Do we gain from mindfulness? Well, not applying all the necessary nuance perhaps. If we look at the bulk of studies, or if we scrutinize the systematic reviews that have been done on the topic, looking at cognitive factors, mood-associated factors in healthy individuals, but also in clinical groups, then, taken together, we can see benefits as a function of mindfulness. Benefits that are similar to, for instance, CBT, if we look at, for instance, substance addiction, to name one example, but also applicable to, for instance, disorders that are characterized by cognitive deficiencies, for instance, ADHD. But again, as I mentioned, that's a crude generalization. The relationship between mindfulness and cognitive factors, mood factors, depends on many moderating factors. So that's really important. These studies are on group level. Not everyone benefits equally. And that we see also represented in the literature. So if we go over recent systematic reviews, then we can see some lack of congruency in the sense that, overall we can see mindfulness benefits, provides beneficial effects, but there is heterogeneity in results. Whereas most studies support an effect, there are also studies that provide relatively more modest support or limited support. So what is then the common denominator? What is mentioned in most systematic reviews is that there is quite some heterogeneity of methodology and how the effects of mindfulness are assessed, experimental designs, and that ultimately translate into a relatively high risk of bias. Again, high risk of bias due to issues with scientific rigor, or I should say rigor of experimental designs of the associated studies. Hence, and perhaps it's a cliche, but it's important to mention that there is really a need for more controlled studies in the field, also looking at moderators that determine the exact relationship between mindfulness and the relevant outcome variables, not only limited to inhibitory control, of course. So why focusing on inhibitory control? It's not just my expertise. I've been focusing on inhibitory control since my PhD, actually since my master program at Utrecht University, but I think it makes perfect sense, with all respect to many other cognitive processes, of course, that are very relevant, also in relation to inhibitory control, by the way. But it's a real key process for adaptive, goal-directed functioning. Maybe first of all, for those that are not familiar with the term, inhibitory control refers to the capacity to stop a prepotent or planned response. We need that, to make it even clearer, we need that for adaptive goal-directed functioning, healthy functioning, because for instance, if we're in a supermarket, and if you look at many supermarkets, of course it varies as a function of countries, but we see a lot of unhealthy yet nice, appetitable, palatable stuff. So let's say we see a nice bag of chips, if that's your thing, then of course that engages approach-associated tendencies, like, okay, grab the bag of chips and, eat the whole bag of chips in a very short time. But fortunately, we have something as inhibitory control or impulse control that withholds us from engaging in maladaptive behaviors. So that's how you can understand inhibitory control. And of course, also the relevance in the context of addiction, in which inhibitory control is unfortunately challenged, as also integrated in the I-PACE model from Brent, which includes many different processes that drive addictive behaviors, not limited to inhibitory control. Well, the good news is that mindfulness, if we look at the bulk of studies, for instance, systematic review of Galland, but also our own work, which I interestingly didn't refer to here, is associated generally with improvements of inhibitory control. But and that's also what we see, and I will show you some of the results of our lab, that's an overgeneralization because it seems to depend on many factors, including but not limited to reward context, whether we observe inhibitory control in context of reward or neutral contexts, but also when is inhibitory control required while you're actually seeing a bag of chips or after fleeting advertisements, for instance. And it makes a difference. And I think that's supported in our studies. Of course, these are just two potential moderating factors. There are many others, such as many different subject characteristics that I won't go into in detail. So yeah, inhibitory control is relevant in relation to driving addiction or perpetuating addiction as outlined in the IPACE model. I've been to many different conferences on addiction, but not limited to addiction. When addiction is outlined, and often there's this reference to this influential model by Brandt. And very interesting, I definitely recommend to read up on it if you are not familiar with this model. Outlines many different components that, as I mentioned, drive addictive behavior, which includes also, and very justifiably so, this inhibitory control component, referred to here in this model as stimulus-specific reduction of inhibitory control. What is meant with that is that, take for instance food addiction, that is often not characterized. It depends a little bit on the study, and I won't hold a lecture on food addiction. Inhibitory control is challenged, but the challenge depends on the exact context. So inhibitory challenges are most predominant when someone, for instance, afflicted with food addiction is exposed to food-associated stimuli, and generally these are palatable food stimuli. Similar to someone afflicted with nicotine addiction, inhibitory control deficits are most marked when they are exposed to stimuli that are associated with smoking. And it can be advertisements, of course not limited to advertisement. So I focus particularly on this component when talking about mindfulness. That being said, obviously mindfulness has also effects, as we see in the literature, on different components of this model. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I focused on the relationship between mindfulness and inhibitory control, which has already been done. There's a lot of studies that have looked at the relationship between mindfulness and inhibitory control, mostly in neutral contexts. And of course, in the context of addiction, we also have to take into account particularly reward context. So that's actually what we focus on most predominantly, and how we do that, you see that here represented using a stop signal paradigm. For those who are not familiar with the stop signal paradigm, it's as follows. So you have, so the one to the left, that's a standard implementation of a stop signal paradigm, where you have a fixation dot. Subsequently, you have the onset of a go stimulus that requires a dual response option. So press left button where you see an X, press right button when you see an very boring task, even though I also programmed it for different platforms. And then in a minority of trials, the go stimulus that requires a response is followed by a stop signal requiring you to inhibit the planned action of responding. And again, I should emphasize it's a minority of trials. So it's really difficult to inhibit, right? If you first want to respond to the go stimulus and then you see an infrequent stop stimulus, it's difficult to inhibit. And now the relevant outcome variable is the stop signal response time. You can see that here represented in the graph on the y-axis, and how you can interpret it. So the computation is relatively challenging. It's not a very easy measure, but if you're interested, you can look up the work from Logan, for instance, or Verbruggen is even easier to follow. But basically, you can interpret it as the speed of the conclusion of the inhibitory process, and has been supported also by brain activity studies. Shorter SSRT is associated with better inhibitory control. That's how you can interpret that. So what we did, we didn't just look at mindfulness in relationship, and in this case dispositional mindfulness, in relation to inhibitory control in a neutral condition, but we added 2 reward conditions following work from Houben, who focused on obesity, and we wanted to see the effect of mindfulness. So what were the reward conditions? So we had a palatable food condition and we had a money condition. So in this case, the go stimulus was replaced by these reward-associated stimuli. Now, most interestingly, what did we find? So first of all, we found a main effect of condition on SSRT. Specifically, we found that inhibitory control was challenged in both in these reward conditions compared to the neutral conditions. So that's not so great news. It's more difficult to restrain yourself when you're exposed to reward-associated information. So if you're in the supermarket, well, you have response action tendencies, especially when you see reward-associated stimuli. So can mindfulness actually help us to say no? Well, that's actually, at least in the money context, it was not generalized to the food context. It's a different type of reward. We can see that mindfulness actually improves inhibitory control, particularly in the money context. So that's good news for, for instance, if you're inclined to go to a casino or do any kind of risky monetary decisions, then apparently mindfulness seems to have some kind of protective effect based on what we found here. So all good news, you would say. Well, that's fantastic, mindfulness protects us. But it's not that simple. We did a subsequent study, which is a different type of study, but very relevant in this context, where again we had an inhibitory control paradigm and conditions that varied as a function of reward context, but in this case we used the go, no-go paradigm because it was easier to program and for some other reasons as well. And then reward context was operationalized as attractive opposite sex individuals in the sample of individuals with heterosexual orientation. The idea is the same, so you have go stimuli that alternate with infrequent stop stimuli, or no-go stimuli is the more appropriate term. And a no-go stimulus was identifiable by the white border around the essentially go-type stimulus. So what did we find? Again, we looked at dispositional mindfulness following the mindfulness attention awareness scale. And we looked at dispositional mindfulness in relation to inhibitory control. And I should emphasize that the outcome measure is different, so it has you have to inversely interpret that. The go, no-go task yields the proportion of inhibitions, and obviously a higher level of proportion of inhibitions is associated with better inhibitory control. Now, what did we find? Well, partly results were congruent with the previous study in that mindfulness was, there was a condition effect. So overall participants performed poorer in the attractive faces conditions. So people had more difficulty inhibit to respond when they were presented with attractive faces. And there's some other studies that show that being exposed to attractive faces makes people more impulsive. Well, again, that's supported also by our findings. But most interestingly, so this is not that novel, but most interestingly, we found the inverse effect in comparison to the previous study of mindfulness and inhibitory control. Specifically, higher levels of dispositional mindfulness resulted in even more reduced inhibitory control in a context of being exposed to attractive faces. So that's not necessarily good news if you would extrapolate it to other reward contexts. Now, what accounts for the difference between these two studies? You could, of course, say, well, it's a different type of reward stimulus. Certainly, it's a different type of reward, but does that really can we really attribute the complete inverse effect to the different type of reward stimuli? It's not that likely if we look at the effect of these different stimuli on the brain. Brain activity correlates of processing rewards in very broad terms, these frontal striatal networks. So that's not really likely. Mostly has to do probably what we think in terms of different operationalization. So there are some very important differences between the two paradigms, and perhaps the most important difference that can account for this different effect is the fact that participants in the go, no-go task had to inhibit while they were exposed to reward-associated information. This was very different from the previous implementation where participants had to inhibit in a neutral context, because the stop signal is always neutral, subsequent to being presented with reward-associated information. And research, another line of research, we didn't do that in our lab, suggests that mindfulness enhances the capacity to disengage from preceding information, including reward-associated information. For instance, studies that follow the attentional blink paradigm. So that could be the case in this case, that participants were better at inhibiting because they could easily disengage from reward-associated information. That's good news for being able to inhibit with fleeting commercials, for instance, where we have some time to think after, being exposed to the reward-associated information. And here, why people are probably have more difficulty to inhibit, especially when mindfulness is high, I would like to refer back to the effects found on the salience network that makes people probably more susceptible for reward-associated information, which translates into higher attentional capture, which complicates subsequent inhibitory control. Now, I see I have very limited time, and I still want to discuss, of course, the effects of potentially boosting mindfulness using EEG feedback. So I will go a bit quicker through this study. Obviously, in the previous study, we used different paradigms. Of course, this notion that I mentioned, we wanted to test within one particular paradigm. So what we did in the subsequent study to look more about the moderating factors, namely when inhibitory would be required and condition, we combined all the possible conditions in terms of the go stimulus and the stop stimulus characterizing reward-associated stimulus. Information. So we had the combination of neutral stimulus, neutral go stimulus, and neutral stop stimulus, money go stimulus, neutrals, and you get the idea. So here we expected, following the notion that I outlined before, we expected an interaction between mindfulness and condition, which, as you can see from the main results, are beautiful parallel lines, almost parallel, so not a real apparent interaction, and the lines represent the different mindfulness levels. So the red line is individuals with relatively high mindfulness as opposed to relatively low mindfulness. So why is that the case? Why is this completely incongruent? I should note that a very important observation is that in contrast to the other studies, we did not find any effect of condition. That was very surprising for us. So probably because we had condition as a within subject factor, so participants performed all the different conditions in one row, certainly counterbalanced, but nevertheless there could be spillover across these conditions. So the conditions, or I should say the general paradigm, could be characterized as one main dynamic reward context. Good news is in such context, such dynamic reward context that individuals anticipate reward all the time, individuals with higher mindfulness do better. So that's a good thing, because generally, if you're in a reward context, generally that's dynamic. So integrating the previous results, overall mindfulness is associated with improved inhibitory control, most notably when inhibitory control is required subsequent to reward-associated information. For instance, if you see fleeting advertisements, and mindfulness is associated with challenged inhibitory control when you're directly exposed to reward-associated information. So potentially it's not a good idea if you have high mindfulness to go to a casino, for instance. Makes you potentially more prone for the effects of salient reward-associated stimuli. Does everyone benefit from mindfulness? Now, probably not. It can be relatively difficult to reach a mindful state. And to potentially help with that, there's this commercially, I'm not affiliated with the Muse headband, by the way, but I refer to it anyway. There's this commercial application that provides feedback on brain activity associated with a mindful state. So how does that work? Well, it's very similar to biofeedback, where participants get feedback on peripheral measures, for instance, cardiovascular measures, and thereby learn to regulate their brain activity. In this case, there are some known brain activity correlates of mindfulness, for instance, theta activity, alpha activity, and you could provide feedback on these components and provide auditory incentives for producing more of this type of activity. Like, for instance, when you have elevation of alpha frequency, theta frequency, participants are hearing bird sounds or calming of the weather and so on. The question is, does it work? So we've done a very preliminary study. There are a lot of aspects that can be improved in terms of the rigor of this study, but I think it's an interesting first attempt to see if there's any potential effect. So we did this study in school-aged children between 8 to 12 years old. Before and after the intervention, they were measured on many executive functions, and they were performing mindfulness training together with EEG feedback on the level of mindfulness. So when alpha amplitude increased and theta amplitude increased, they heard pleasurable sounds, thereby reinforcing the production of brain activity associated with a mindful state. Now the question is, does it work? Well, the preliminary findings show some support. So they improve on various executive functions, not limited to inhibitory control. And they were congruent with EEG changes from pre to post intervention as compared to a control group. Now I have to mention before everyone's like, wow, yeah, I'm going to buy the Muse. What we don't know to what degree we can actually attribute the effects to very specific aspects of the EEG feedback, because to be able to do that, you have to include a sham control group. So we'll skip to the take-home message and wrap up. So the take-home messages is, well, there's more research needed. It's a cliche, but certainly there's more research needed. We're actually looking more at the brain mechanism of mindfulness at this point in a lab. Key to treatment in general is understanding the disorder even better and potential targets for intervention, and understanding the treatment also better. Overall we can say that studies suggest positive effects pertaining to mindfulness, and overall, what our studies suggest that mindfulness may improve inhibitory control, the capacity to inhibit ourselves in dynamic reward-associated contexts. And EEG feedback might be, especially for non-responders, might be a potential method to actually boost the effect of mindfulness. So I hope I was still a little bit in the time frame.
Okay, thank you.